Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's event on preparing for a post-pandemic workforce. I'm Kenneth Megan, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. COVID-19 has strained America's labor market and worsened existing inequalities. It has also accelerated trends towards automation, providing both challenges and opportunities for American workers. Today's event will analyze these challenges, and we'll also discuss how the federal government can help equip workers with the skills needed to excel in the post-pandemic landscape. Now, before we get started, I'd like to give a big thanks to Workday for supporting this event, as well as the Black Economic Alliance and Jobs for the Future for co-hosting. And with that, let me introduce Dane Stangler, Director of Strategic Initiatives here at BPC, who will in turn introduce and lead a discussion with our keynote speaker, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware. Dane, take it away.
Thanks, Kenny, and welcome everyone who's watching. I have the distinct pleasure of chatting with Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester for this event. The Congresswoman represents Delaware's at-large congressional district. She has interest in committee assignments across a wide variety of issue areas, but most relevant for today's topic, she's worked for several years on issues related to American workers, and she co-created the Future of Work Caucus in the House. Congresswoman, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dane, for having me. And it's good to be a part of this very, very important discussion. And I also want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for the work that you do every day. It's probably more important now than ever. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Congresswoman. We're going to dig right in, be respectful of your time. So as you know, today at this event, we're talking about the post-pandemic workforce. That term incorporates both the struggles that we've seen millions of American workers deal with over the last year, but it also encapsulates some of the longer-term trends that we saw pre-pandemic that have been accelerated and that we're starting to already see affect the workforce coming out of the pandemic. I want to start with the home view. Talk to us about what you're seeing back home in Delaware with workers and how they've been affected and how they're confronting the post-pandemic landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question to start with. And Delaware is pretty much a microcosm of the rest of the country. I mean, we're made up of tourism, we have beaches, we also have, a large burgeoning healthcare sector, but we have a lot of small businesses. And I would say that probably our small businesses, our restaurants, our nonprofits, all of these different industries, workers were really stretched, scared, not sure what was going to happen. And so, the first efforts of us as members of Congress to come together and pass those very first major packages to get that PPP as well as the PPE out to folks so that they could be protected was really important. But also, people's fears just about unemployment insurance. And we have gig workers as well. So as we talk about the future of work, we also know that many people might not even be tied to a traditional job. And so this was really a moment for Delaware to make sure that we could attack this head on, just like we did across the country. And I would say that the caucus itself was really set up with this kind of thinking in mind about not knowing that it would be a pandemic that would push it. And I'm glad you also brought up the issue of, kind of the disparities and inequities that already existed prior to the pandemic, but then they were exacerbated. And so in Delaware, I mean, even as we've seen across the country, you've seen women in particular be impacted harshly by this pandemic, as well as people of color. The numbers are staggering. They even are calling it a she-cession because the impact on women has been so great. So like the rest of the country, it's been affecting multiple jobs and job types.
You've hit all the issues that I know our panel following this discussion is going to hit on. It's some really important ones, both on the negative side, also on the positive side. I want to ask you specifically about the Future of Work Caucus, which you created. Tell us about your motivations for creating that caucus, and how has the pandemic shaped how you're now going to approach the work of that caucus?
Well, I have to, since this is the Bipartisan Policy Center, I have to also shout out my colleague, Representative Brian Stile from Wisconsin, who is actually the co-chair of the Future of Work Caucus, Republican. And when I came in my freshman term, after being elected first time to anything in 2016, I started hearing everyone talk about the issues of automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, whether it was a farm that I went to in Delaware and the woman was in her kitchen doing everything through her iPad, to the newspaper, to the editorial board head on their whiteboard, the future of the paper. It seemed to keep coming up. And again, this was pre-pandemic. And then when I met with Congressman Stile, he also had a manufacturing background. So we talked about the fact that manufacturing has changed and there's advanced manufacturing, clean, everything is different than the old days, but that many of our systems have not kept pace. And so the real thought was that we as a country needed a North Star to not only look at the quality of work and how we do things here, but also to be competitive with the rest of the world, as we were looking at other countries saying that they were going to surpass us in many of these areas. So that was the inspiration. But I would say that the pandemic has shifted not so much the focus of making sure that we're prepared for the future of work and prepared for now, but it has also created a sense of urgency. It has created a sense of urgency, and it has also pushed us. So now all these years we've been talking about distance learning. We had to do it. People have been talking about telework. Companies started doing it. We've been talking about telehealth. And now there's an explosion in the number of people, but it also means we have greater demands on our infrastructure as well and how we do things. So the impetus was what I was seeing and hearing, e-commerce, you could go down the whole line, but the pandemic pushed it to the fore and created a greater sense of urgency and created an opportunity for us to do some things together as a country, Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
We certainly appreciate at the Bipartisan Policy Center your close work with Congressman Stile. I want to ask you just a quick question about that relationship.
Style, and you can
Style. I'm sorry, I apologize. Style.
To remember it because he's got style. So there you go.
Thank you, Congressman Stile. I want to ask you about that. We try to work on bipartisan issues every day at the BPC, and of course, there's all sorts of coverage about hyperpartisanship and polarization. Can you just give us a quick bit of background on how that's working and how you see bipartisanship functioning in Washington today?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very important and tough question right now. I mean, the reality is I was one of the individuals that was trapped up in the gallery, up in the balcony when the insurrection happened on January 6th. And so, as someone who experienced that, knowing what the inspiration for that was, to me, that was a symptom of many underlying issues that we have to face as a country. Again, the reason why I focused on the future of work was because I felt that we needed to find common ground. A lot of times we hear a concept and we get in our corner and then we don't talk about, well, what does that mean? And what is it that is really our goal here? And so one of the reasons that this caucus is so important is because we want to have a place where we can have dialogue, deeper dialogue about issues that are going to affect all of us. And, after everything took place, I remember reaching out to Representative Stile and saying, are we still in this together? And we both agreed that we are, and that it's vital. And especially as we look toward an infrastructure package that's coming, as we look toward what opportunities are out there to make sure that we as a country both recover, rebuild, and restore our faith in each other. This is a vital time. And so, to your question, I think we're already seeing individuals that are finding those areas where we can work together. But at the same time, I think there's also a realization that we can't wait. We can't play political games. People's lives are literally, their lives and livelihoods are literally on the line. So, it's just a very important time. And I appreciate the work that you do because you're creating that safe space for people to have these experiences. I got a chance to have a bipartisan exchange, a few of them through your organization. And I got to go to one of my colleagues' homes, towns, and find out, well, why do you do things this way? And what's behind your thinking, seeking to understand, and then also to showcase my own state. And I think that's probably more important now than ever.
Well, thank you for those comments and for your participation in the Congressional Exchange program. We're certainly very proud of that. I want to ask you a couple more questions about the topic today about workers and workforce. You referenced the impact of technology on workers, whether it's automation or helping workers do their jobs in different ways. We hear a lot about the negative impacts of technology, replacing workers, putting people out of work, and we've certainly seen that trend. We also know, as you referenced, that technology helps workers. It enhances their productivity. It helps them focus on higher skill areas. You referenced agriculture. Certainly, we're seeing that in that area and other places as well. What's the role of public policy in that enhancement function of technology? How do we encourage that trend?
Well, I think first of all, we have to start off with the realization that, yeah, there is real fear out there about what this could mean for people's jobs. I mean, 1 in 5 Americans have reported that their job has been automated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is not so much about automation, but about whether or not the quality of your job improves, whether or not you have a job, whether or not your wages are stagnant. And those are the kind of questions, and whether or not we have that real social contract, a new social contract for our country. So I love this conversation because, when I think about what role can Congress play, first of all, it's leadership. Again, that's why we created this caucus, to say, instead of being fearful, let's lean in. Secondly, there are people that are getting left behind, and we have a role to ensure that that doesn't happen. And there are things that we're doing, such as, the passage of the, in the House side so far, the passage of the National Apprenticeship Act. I mean, to be able to provide apprenticeships, we know that those provide good jobs, and that's real and tangible. But we also know that our country, we don't utilize the apprenticeships as much as other places in the world. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act reauthorization, it's time for us to reauthorize it, but to think about the lessons that we've learned and to improve on it. We in Congress can provide support to caregiving sector. I mean, we've seen through this pandemic that was one of the reasons many people left the workforce, because they had to balance taking care of a family member, a child, or make a choice to go to work. STEM education. We could go on and on of the things that we can do. One of the bills that I'm actually a co-lead on is the Jobs Act, which would provide short-term Pell Grants for low-income individuals that are seeking job training programs. And even in our own state, the governor took the CARES dollars and created a more rapid response to job training and getting people quickly into new fields of work called Forward Delaware. Those are examples of things that we can do. But it really does require us to focus on providing a better quality of jobs to equate to a better quality of life. And those are some of the things that we can do in Congress. We now have this big infrastructure program that we're talking about. And again, we can look at the intersection between a good job, the economy, the environment, if we make them environmentally friendly, and then from there, better health outcomes as well. So I have another bill called Open Back Better. Not that I'm plugging any of my bills, but that's another one that, again, can create jobs, help our health. And then if we do it in a lens of equity, one of the things that we know that this pandemic has shown, as I said, is the inequalities that existed and the disparities. And so when we do it with that lens, we try to help all boats rise.
Well, you've raised many more important topics than I have time to talk to you about.
I know. I can get into the whole thing of benefits, portable benefits, so that people can actually do jobs and move across the country, scalable, universal. Oh, don't get me started. This is my topic right here. But I know that's a bunch of great experts coming. So I'm glad I was
there. No, your passion and your dedication are not only evident, but that they're inspiring as well. I think I have time for one more question for you before we get to our panel. I want to pick up on what you just talked about there and in your opening comments about the inequities and inequalities we've seen and how we can address those through our workforce development systems. You talked about the National Apprenticeship Act. You referenced WIOA reauthorization, kind of coming on the horizon. How are you thinking about, how is you and Congressman Stile, how should we be thinking about how we evolve those workforce development systems for everyone, for all workers, but also for those folks who, we know are facing challenges on the margins of the workforce, and they're having trouble reintegrating.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the issues of our times, and like I said, even just looking at this through an equity lens, we see everything from starting from the cradle in terms of what kind of supports we provide and how prepared we are as a country and as a people. And I think that, this moment, this past year, I look at it as really a time when our country will be transformed. I don't think we can ever go back. I don't think we can go back from a pandemic. I think we will be changed. I don't think you can go back from the murder of George Floyd and not have your eyes opened in some way. There's a saying, stay woke. You can't stay woke if your eyes are closed. And so I think that, as well as the very democracy that we hold so dear in the form of an insurrection, we will be forever changed. And the question is, and I ask every business person, I ask my constituents, what do each of us want to do and do differently in this moment? This conversation you're having is very, very vital, very vital. I think, number one, us acknowledging that each of us matters and that nobody should be left behind. That is something that should be a core value for us as a country. And the acknowledgement of what this country was built on. And so I continue to have hope. And maybe it's, as a Black woman, I have to have hope. That's what gets me up in the morning. And I think that doing this work, and what everyone who is tuning in, I hope you just do your part. Just do your part in this moment. Be changed because of what we all experienced. Let it ignite you. One of the slides I saw when this started was John Lewis. And I will just end with the fact that I was so proud to have served with him. But what he had was this fierce determination that was wrapped up in love. That everything we do, we're not doing it just for $1. We're doing it because we care about each other. And we care about our families, and we care about our country, and we care about the world. And so that inspires me, that keeps me going. I hope that through this you get practical tips, but you also find what is your part in this moment. It's a special, important time. It's a special, important time, and we will not waste it. I will not waste it. So.
Representative von Rochester, that was a fantastic opening piece to what I'm sure is going to be a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your comments, and thank you to you and to Congressman Stile. We look forward to working with both of you on these issues.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and do your part.
Thank you. I'll turn back over to my colleague, Kenny Megan, to lead our panel discussion for this event.
Thank you so much, Dane, and thank you so much, Congresswoman. Let's move on to our panel. I'll keep these intros short because we have a limited amount of time today, but their full bios are available on the events page of BBC's website. So joining us today, we have Peter Kallstrom, President and CEO of the San Diego Workforce Partnership, Mary Claggett, Senior Director of Jobs for the Future, David Clooney, Executive Director of the Black Economic Alliance, and Chandler Morse, Head of the DC Office and North American Public Policy at Workday. We also encourage our viewers to participate in today's conversation by submitting questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using hashtag BBC Live. We'll leave the last 15 minutes or so of the event to address your questions directly. And with that, let's get started. I want to start off with a big picture question for Mary. Can you describe at a high level how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the American workforce and why this economic downturn may be different than previous ones?
Sure, and thanks for having me today. Obviously, it has just decimated certain industries such as hospitality and tourism, travel, certain portions of the retail industry, as well as impacted everything else in this country. And so, we've seen major disproportionate impact on populations of color, on individuals who are lower skilled, individuals who are at lower wage jobs. I know one of the things that we had talked about was the impact on women. The impact on women has just been devastating, particularly women of color and women who tend to dominate industries that I mentioned a few minutes ago, low wage jobs. During the first 10 months of the pandemic, women lost a net 5.4 million jobs, nearly a million more than men, with Black, Hispanic, and Asian women hit hardest. These job losses have also combined with women being the primary caregivers by and large for children. And so the devastation that has been caused, to our child care infrastructure in the country and the closure of schools has resulted in not only women losing jobs, but a lot of women deciding to leave the workforce generally. And I guess the last point I want to make is the Center for American Progress estimates that the combination of women leaving the workforce, being forced out of the workforce, and reducing work hours is going to amount to about $64.5 billion in lost wages and economic activity in the country annually if we don't do something about it.
Those are staggering numbers. David, so as the CEO of the Black Economic Alliance, which is an organization focused on improving outcomes for Black Americans, I'd love your perspective on kind of the pandemic's effect on people of color in particular.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and thank you for having me for this discussion and having a Black Economic Alliance with you. So Mary touched on it a bit, and I think we've heard the term systemic inequities more in the last year than I think I have in my lifetime before that. And what it's talking about is that there have been persistent racial inequities and disparities in housing, education, wealth, healthcare, and just about every American institution that have made communities of color more vulnerable to the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. So it's created this dangerous combination of Black and Latinx workers in particular being more exposed to frontline jobs that require them to go to work in person during the pandemic, and they're not able to work from home and or more likely to lose their jobs. But then you layer on top of that a lot of these folks have not had access to healthcare before. So they're essentially starting off in a worse place in terms of health and their economic stability than their white counterparts, and they're more vulnerable to both the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. And you add on top of that even things like subpar housing conditions, kind of population density where a lot of people of color live. And it has just really created this higher risk of both contracting the virus and then worse impacts and outcomes when they do get the virus. So economically, the pre-existing condition really is the vulnerability to the labor market and the lack of economic stability. We know that before the pandemic, for example, the average or the median household income of Black families was 1/10 that of white families at about $17,000 for Black families, $171,000 for white families. So there's just no cushion. And since the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been keeping statistics on the workforce since 1971, Black unemployment has largely been about twice that of the white rate, even when you control for education levels and gender. And as Mary talked about again, Black workers and Latinx workers are over-indexed in the jobs that are kind of low skill, low wage, and that before the pandemic, we're already going away to automation, and that trend has just been exacerbated by the pandemic. So essentially, Black and Latinx workers are kind of the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And then even business owners, and I'll make this last point, that a majority of Black businesses are concentrated in the industries that are hardest hit by the pandemic, like hospitality and restaurants, and a lot of them were operating at thin margins and only had a few weeks of cash, of operating cash before the pandemic. So, asking them to close down even temporarily for a few weeks or months, forget a whole year, or operating at half capacity is essentially a death sentence for the companies. So, and then we know that they have already had a lack of access to capital from all sources. And I think the PPP program has shown us, has kind of laid bare the systemic inequities in terms of Black and Latinx businesses' ability to gain access to capital. So all these things come together and really just result in a significantly worse set of outcomes for communities of color, unfortunately.
Thanks, David. So Peter, as the head of a workforce board, I'm interested in kind of your take on how COVID-19 has affected your operations in San Diego. What are the biggest challenges that you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and great to be with this panel, and really inspiring words from the Congresswoman to kick it off. Really needed that on this Monday morning out here in San Diego. The impact has been really dramatic in the workforce space. We have 550 workforce boards across the country of all different shapes and sizes. And in normal times, it's a very in-person, human centered process. So to go from that model to switching to virtual overnight was doable by a number of us, but really difficult for many, because that's just not the sweet spot of what workforce development in normal times is. So we've been able to make that switch, and many others, but it's a real struggle if you're trying to reach the tsunami of layoffs that were occurring early last year. And certainly that's abated and changed over time, but to be able to provide virtual services in a very human process is a challenge ongoing, and what that will look like in the future. And then also to be able to provide flexible, fast reskilling approaches that are different from the prior model. In the in-person model, it's going to be a lot of hands-on, and it's individual training accounts that come through WIOA and helping people to go to training in person. And now to do all that from your laptop or your home office, or even if you don't have one, if you don't have the resources for it, is a tremendous challenge for the impacted job seekers who have been laid off in droves. And then for them not even knowing if their job or company or sector is going to come back, how do we as a workforce system provide them with low cost or no cost training to rapidly reskill during this past year and going forward? So that's a real shift in model. And fortunately, we've been able to do so with the support of a number of partners in the corporate world and philanthropy who've helped us switch. But we have to be able to do this much more proactively and intentionally going forward and meet the needs so that we can help people get back to work. And most importantly, again, reskilling, because a lot of those jobs and companies won't be coming back. And to be able to help people identify what is for them, what do they want to do, what's their strengths, interest, and values in work, and how do we help them get to that new stage in their career. On San Diego as a local economy, hospitality, tourism, in-person, beautiful weather, and that economy has to come back. We can't be a virtual world. And to be able to support our businesses so that they can thrive and come back is just as important as being able to help the job seeker reskill if they want to move into a new career.
So you touched on a few really interesting points there about some jobs just aren't going to come back, and how do we deal with this as a society? So we've touched on this issue a bit so far, but many experts are talking about this long-term trend towards automation in the US economy and how it's been accelerated by COVID-19. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the contours of this issue, kind of focusing on both, not only just the challenges, but also potential opportunities that this might present to the US labor force.
Would you like me to comment on that piece as well?
Yeah, sure.
Happy to. Yeah, there will be much more automation for sure. And we've been going in that direction for some time, but just as much as those who are fortunate to be able to work remotely have been able to be okay during this time and will go forward, we're not going to have a economy that will just bypass that in-person work and the hands-on work. So being able to get our economy back to as close to normal as possible is so crucial, because we can't just have a world of IT workers and people working from home and not interacting in the world. And so it's both. We've got to still be able to support our restaurants and our conventions and our conferences and the hotels. They're so vibrant to be able to support our economy. And we have to be able to get back to as much normalcy as possible, because reskilling for the remote world, and for those who can succeed in that, great. And we've got things in place like an income share agreement approach that's really been very timely for this. We launched it 2 years ago, and that helps people retrain remotely to be able to get IT careers and get really well-paying, sustaining jobs going forward into the future. But that's a segment of our society. But restaurants still have to come back, and hotels, and we have to be able to support the economic vitality of our region so that we're all not working purely remotely and trying to train for a Zoom future. I don't want that, and I don't think our world wants that. We want to get out and interact with people, get your shots, let's get past this and let's get back to as much normal as possible.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a good time to pivot a little bit, kind of focusing on the skills issue. So Chandler, your organization Workday is a proponent of emphasizing skills in broader workforce development conversations. So why are skills important, and how has your organization sought to leverage tech to advance this focus on skills?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kenneth. And it's great to hear Congresswoman von Rochester, but man, it's tough to follow that act for sure. And just want to say thank you for also putting me on this panel with some old friends and some new friends now. Workday is a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications for finance and human resources, and our services have been adopted by a little bit more than 45% of the Fortune 500. So we really have a bird's eye view into this generational transformation that's going on in the workforce, whether it's from that technological innovation or from the response from COVID. And when we see this kind of transformation, we really need to make sure that workers and employers have the agility to navigate these kinds of shifts. And so from Workday's perspective, we see skills as the currency of the changing world of work, and we believe that skills offers the right framework in approaching today's workforce challenges. We put that into practice with our Skills Cloud. So that's a skills ontology, or a way of understanding what makes up a skill, and how skills relate to different skills that are constantly evolving. Our Skills Cloud leverages machine learning technology to just process a massive amount of data and information to cleanse, understand, and relate job skills in real time in a way that can be made sense of. So what does that mean? Well, for job seekers and workers, that Skills Cloud powers critical features that can enable them to better describe the skills that they actually have, which can be a tough challenge, as well as determine which skills they need to grow their career, as well as identify some additional learning opportunities. From an industry side, it helps understand that skills gap that we've all heard about, but really put some meaningful specificity to that, and also allow companies to more effectively match the talent that they have to opportunities that are growing, and base their workforce planning around their most important asset, which are their people. So our Skills Cloud powers features like Talent Marketplace, which helps workers match their talents with existing internal opportunities, so they can sort of try to grow their experience and careers, as well as Career Hub, which provides a skills-focused career development platform that helps them plan next steps and explore new skills. Innovation is a core value for Workday, and so we're excited about continuing to leverage technology to help navigate this pretty rapidly changing world of work with a focus on skills.
Interesting. And so I know you've been engaged in a lot of conversations around town on this concept of a skills-based approach to talent. Can you kind of describe what this is to folks that might not be aware of it, and talk about why it's starting to gain some traction?
Sure, I'll take the traction first. I think it's just the sheer scale of the shift we're seeing in the economy that's driving everyone to sort of look for creative approaches and kind of an all of the above solution. The World Economic Forum found that a little bit less than half of jobs will require some new skills in the next 3 years, and estimated a billion workers are going to need to be reskilled by 2030. I think as everyone has has already touched on, the COVID response has really driven the kind of disruption we've all been trying to prepare for, and it's made it a reality in a time frame that I don't think anyone really thought possible. I know I didn't think possible. More importantly, and others have touched on it more eloquently than I will, it's not affecting everyone the same, right? It's exacerbating longstanding inequalities. So, you know, I was reading a Pew Center study that highlighted that Latinos, for example, are really hard hit when it comes to COVID, wage reductions, and job losses. And all of this is happening, as the Congresswoman mentioned, at a time when we're in the middle of this national conversation about needing meaningful steps towards equality, social justice, economic opportunity. And so it's really exciting, the number of places I'm going around town where the skills-based focus is coming into the conversation, and much of it has to do with sort of equality and economic opportunity. When you look at a skills-based approach, you can create a more equitable job market by screening people in for the skills that they have versus screening people out for not having a traditional credential. And I think we all know that sometimes those traditional credentials can be a barrier that'll disproportionately affect, you know, underrepresented minorities or socially economically disadvantaged, or even veterans. And so surfacing opportunities based on what people can do versus based on sort of unnecessary attributes, we think can promote equality, can promote equitable economic opportunity, and really drive that agility that I mentioned earlier. I'm frankly excited. I've just to tag on to a little bit of the Congresswoman's enthusiasm, you know, whether it's the practices employers are looking for, or the supports that NGOs are trying to offer, or policymakers, there's a real sense that we can make some meaningful progress in workforce policy along the skills line today.
Great, thanks,
and
Chandler.
I see Mary nodding her head, which I'm pleased, because if she's agreeing with what I'm saying, then I'm all right. Then I'm good.
So let's switch gears. We don't have much time left, so I'd like to switch gears to kind of policy solutions to these challenges. So the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIO, has been mentioned several times during this event today. I'm interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on, number one, do you think this has a shot at moving through Congress this year because it's up for reauthorization? And then number two, how would you like to see the legislation reform the federal government's role in workforce policy? And Mary, if you want to start off, and then I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well on this.
Yeah, I would love to start on that. I do think that WIO will probably move this year. And one of the main reasons I think it will is because there are a certain number of things that need to be done to modernize the system so that it can implement what we're all hoping will be a significant increase in funding for the workforce system. One of the most exciting things that's happening right now is the Biden administration has announced an over $2 trillion American Jobs Plan that is their big push for infrastructure as well as job creation. At least it's part one of a push. And as a part of that, they've proposed $100 billion for increased funding for workforce development. Some of that will come through the WIO system. Some of it will go to community colleges. Some will go directly to communities that are high poverty and underrepresented communities. But we don't know the actual details yet. But there's a lot of talk right now about the kinds of changes that are needed in the workforce system to accommodate that level of funding and to make sure that people do receive the skills training that will put them in a good place, particularly people who have been displaced and low-wage workers, low-skilled individuals, put them in a better place to have the skills that are necessary for this changing economy. So, you know, we're very excited about that. And again, I think there are so many things that we could talk about. I could talk about right now the kinds of changes that need to occur in the workforce system. But again, I think funding, quite honestly, is the biggest thing because it's such an underfunded system right now. So I'll let other people talk, but I'm happy to keep talking about this. So,
So Peter, from a kind of workforce board perspective, interested in hearing your thoughts on how WIOA should be kind of reformed in this potential reauthorization.
Yeah, Mary hit on the important points, and just to emphasize that without funding, policy doesn't matter. And we've had some reduction of about 50 to 60% in the past 20 years in the workforce space. That's devastating. And we can talk all day long about what bits and pieces could be reformed. And there's a lot, and a lot of our colleagues, JFF is doing great work on this, National Skills Coalition, National Association of Workforce Boards. So the work is in place in order to put in good policy. WIOA is a big step up from WIA, its predecessor, and other prior acts. So I'm confident that a good policy will come out of all of the conversation, and I'm hopeful too that it will be reauthorized this year. And we went a number of years without WIA being reauthorized. So again, without funding, we can't do this work. And with those kinds of cuts, we can't serve our dislocated workers and our employers. We can talk about it, but we can't do it. And even in the past year, there's been no increase in workforce funding despite all of the impacts. And of course, we're pleased that the dollars that have gone out so far are for public health and restoring our economy through whatever means can be done. But this the jobs plan of Biden's is crucial, because to put it in context, we've been fighting for just like $1 billion. Give us $1 billion in order to try and do this work, because that would at least help with being able to manage a quadrupling of our requests and demand in the past year, and switch into online and trying to put in place all these tools, scrambling to meet the need and to reach people. The $100 billion will go across community colleges and Title I and all the other crucial areas. With that, we can do wonders. We can really restore the American workforce. We can rapidly reskill people where they want to go. And it all comes down to the money. And fortunately, now we have in place a really progressive proposal by the administration in order to meet that need. So if WIO comes through, it's about local flexibility, local control, and really being able to be nimble without being constrained by too much red tape. I mean, that's kind of broad and vague, but that's crucial, because if you have to over-report or you're getting caught in too much output versus outcome, then we're losing the race of really being able to reach people flexibly, fast, and again, rapid reskilling and at low cost. And how do we do that on a local area in really creative and innovative ways to reach the needs, so that people don't have to get that 4-year degree, but they can go through like an ISA model, get new skills, and get a job that can pay 6 figures based upon a certificate. That can be done. So we need more flexibility.
More flexibility. So David, I know the Black Economic Alliance has several policy recommendations related to workforce. Would love to hear about those, and then also what your thoughts are on how the federal government should work to better promote racial equity in workforce policy.
Yeah, so, as we've talked about a little bit before, an overarching objective is to bridge the gap between Black workers who are over-indexed in low-skilled, low-wage jobs and the in-demand industries like tech, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, construction, that we know are already the economy of the future and will continue to grow and are the fastest growing industries. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. We're looking for, I think we've had I've appreciated some of the conversations we've had about during the pandemic and around stimulus packages, around things like things that help improve the infrastructure, let's say, of the workforce. So things like paid leave, childcare, trying to provide better supports for working parents, especially women, pushing a living wage. The conversation around trying to get to $15 an hour really is not in our mind a North Star, that gets workers working a 40-hour work week to about $31,000 a year, which I do not think should be the goal, but it should be more about what do we do to kind of ensure a living wage for all workers where they can work a job and make ends meet. But then speaking of infrastructure, there are a lot of opportunities in the upcoming infrastructure package that we hope will be successful and pass in a big way to tie big projects to demographic and even geographic needs. So things like requiring standards for Black and Latinx workers and the location of particular jobs around certain projects that will come out under the infrastructure package, and really building a stronger pipeline to things like historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, essentially going to where the need is. And we can even take some examples of some private sector initiatives, like one called 110 that was launched in December, along with Charles Phillips, one of the BEA co-chairs and co-founders, was instrumental in putting this program together. And essentially it's an initiative of the private sector to train, hire, and promote 1 million Black workers over 10 years. And they essentially do that by pooling resources and supporting training programs that have been working, but doing it in a way that is deliberately targeted at Black workers. So organizations like Proscala, Year Up, and others that we know have been successful, but helping them actually get to the places that are in need. And then even thinking about infrastructure, again, improving transportation to reach in-demand jobs, broadband deployment, housing. I talked about the care economy. So all of those things helping improve not only the infrastructure that helps our economy work better, but also the infrastructure that allows us to reach a broader swath of eligible workers to drive the economy, with a particular focus on trying to level the playing field with workers of color and communities of color that we know have had a harder time gaining that access. And really the role of the federal government, I think I've been really impressed in the last year and even just the first few months of this new Congress and the Biden administration, talking about how we got here. For example, Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, talking about the history of racism in city planning decisions in our transportation system. And I think acknowledging how we got here, not as a way to wag our finger at government and say, this is your fault, you have to fix it, but more to prescribe the problem. You can't fix what you can't measure. So I think having a more honest conversation, which we're starting to do about how we got here, will help us figure out how to unpack and counteract some of the impacts and legacy of those decisions.
Thanks, David. So we're running out of time, and I want to leave some time for audience questions because it looks like we have a lot of them. But I have one final question. I'd like to go around the horn on this. If you could wave a magic wand and implement just one federal reform to worker training, what would it be? And let's start with Mary.
It has to be funding and quality measures. Yeah.
A more uniform way to measure quality in WIOA programs.
Particularly for training programs. For short-term training, I mean, we completely agree on skills-based training. We think there are a lot of private sector options that should be taken advantage of, but we have to find a way of determining quality. So people are comfortable putting federal dollars into those.
Mm-hmm. David.
I think I mentioned it before, but I would take a sharp focus at locating training programs in disinvested, underserved communities, particularly communities of color. A lot of folks have a hard time getting to or even finding out about workforce training programs.
All right. Peter?
Yeah, both great points. And one just other new area that I think would be great for DC to focus on, and that's how to make real meaningful connections between Department of Education and Department of Labor, and to dive into K through 12 as a connector to the workforce space. It's something that we're spending a lot more time on now because traditionally they're very discrete. And so education does its part, and then workforce is dealing with some of the fallout of the K through 12 work that isn't aligned with what does this mean for youth going through school? How does academics is relevant to what they're thinking about in the future instead of memorization and the academic framework? But how do we combine these two efforts so that youth are thinking about who they are and how that aligns to what the careers are out there? As my friend Ed Hidalgo says at Cajon Valley School District, how do kids aspire to careers they don't know exist? They get through K through 12 and then they go, now what do I do? But if it's embedded early, then you can really make a smooth pathway into the workforce and put us out of work. We don't need workforce development if we can do that alignment early on.
Interesting. Chandler.
I think the number one thing, there's a bunch of things, as everyone said, and it's a great perspective, but the president's infrastructure proposal calls for a focus on new skills and in-demand jobs in high demand sectors, and we just don't have the data to figure out where those are at the moment. So a public-private partnership around real-time economy-wide trends in employment that can really hone in on what those emerging roles are. The economy's flipped upside down and it's different regionally, but that sort of ONET was charged with sort of looking at longitudinal roles over a long time. I think we need a version of that for emerging roles, and we need it like yesterday.
Interesting. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so let's take some questions from the audience. This one's from Sarah Donovan. Is expanded access to workplace leave important in the post-pandemic workforce? If so, what types of leave, sick, maternity, general time off, should be paid? And should it be a federal mandate or voluntary? And I'm not sure who wants to take this one.
Could I say yes, all the above? Well, I think yes, we should expand paid leave. The federal government, whether it should be mandated, it's interesting. I think the federal government's policies in some ways are for their own employees, in my experience, have been less expansive than the private sector in a lot of places. So I think there are places where the federal government could take some lessons from the private sector, but I do think setting a high standard and a national standard is good to do, but I think highlighting the folks who have done it well might be better than mandating it.
And maybe another thing to add on to that would be things like stable scheduling. And this all leads into job quality. Aspen has done great work in this space. So leave is crucial, but stable scheduling, when we did a white paper recently asking workers, would they rather have a raise or predictable scheduling? They took the latter. And how do you work with employers so that they're not overly burdened with what that means in practice? But it's a local level issue too. And our city council is even looking at an ordinance to try and put that in place so that there's just really good job quality measures and they all kind of come together as a broader concept around job quality.
Yeah, and I was talking earlier about the impact that this pandemic has had on women, but historically, all of these issues have a huge impact on women in the workforce. And particularly right now, as we're looking at a lot of people choosing or being forced out of the labor market, I think we do need to increasingly look at different forms of leave scheduling issues. I mean, all of these job quality kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here's a question from Erica Groshen about data in WIO and workforce training. So to what extent do we need more timely and granular labor and economic data to guide policy? And where can we find this data? Should we be better utilizing government administrative data from UI systems or improving our official statistics?
Such a crucial issue, and it's so important in being able to measure how we're doing. And it's a struggle in the workforce system because it's a very broad measure of a lot of different data points. And so having open access to that data and having just far better access to it from the Department of Labor is great, but then we have the other third-party vendors, and how do we pull this together so that the local boards aren't trying to pull this together all the time and report in very clumsy ways oftentimes because we're so busy and deep in the work that we oftentimes don't have a great opportunity or the capacity to be able to pull that data. We're one of the larger boards, so we're able to do it more effectively than others, but I really feel for the smaller boards that may have one IT staff person, if that, to be able to do this work and to pull and analyze and report in meaningful ways. We're actually working with Brookings on this work right now. They've formed a small group of board directors like myself. And so we're spending a lot more time in that. In our case, this is super important because we don't know how well we're doing unless we can really get our arms around the data, but we have to have access to the data. So open data standards and sharing agreements are just crucial in being able to show the ROI of all that we do.
I couldn't agree more. I think at the end of the day, if we get the funding right, which my assumption is that picture will at least improve, hopefully.
Right.
At some point, somebody says, well, I want to go get reskilled. And the question becomes, well, in what? And that the data around how to meaningfully increase skills to link to economic opportunity, that linkage is a data linkage, and we need to sort of get all hands on deck to try to open standards, public-private partnership, all of the above to create that information.
And in the public workforce space, we have this eligible training provider list, the ETPL, which is really crucial, where dollars flow from the Department of Labor monies that we have to help people do training. Being able to get at that data in deeper, more meaningful and quick ways is tough, but we all have to kind of reinvent our own ETPL analysis as we work. And it's easier said than done, because there's a lot of data that goes into performance and placement and wage change. And so being able to have deep, meaningful access to data is one of the missing quality pieces of our work. And with more funding that can come, that can help us do that work with third-party groups and so forth, will really, again, be part of the game changer, because there is great ROI in the public workforce system, but we just have a really hard time getting at that.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I completely agree with everything that's been said. And you heard the Congresswoman talking earlier, not only about data in WIOA, but also the potential of expanding Pell Grants to include short-term credentials. And all of our ability to do that, our ability to confidently invest more funding in WIOA, depends upon us making these kinds of improvements in our employment training provider lists and other data to show that ROI that Peter was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just also a +1 on employer-led reskilling incentives. It's just going to take all of these different avenues and encapsulating that on sort of a good sense of what's going on is necessary.
Here's a question from Matt List. With the federal deficit set to reach near 15% of GDP in 2021, are there any antiquated programs that we can eliminate so we can invest in some modern job programs and solutions being discussed today?
That's a tough question. I'm sure there probably are. I don't know that there are within the workforce training space. I wouldn't want to say that there are necessarily in that space. I just want to impress upon people that we only fund WIOA formula funding for adults, dislocated worker, and youth at $3.6 billion per year. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Compared
the
to
fraction of the need.
Compared to almost 30 billion in Pell for traditional students. And so a lot of times people talk about job training programs as being antiquated and ineffective, but there is not the funding to provide the kind of training in those programs right now. So I just want to make that point.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say antiquated so much as if things are ineffective, we stop doing them. We don't want antiquated, inefficient programs. We want to put the dollars where the need is and to really make it effective. That's I think a core value across our system. Yeah, there may be some clumsy overlapping programs out of the federal government. That wouldn't be startling to anybody, but nobody wants that. We want to end it. And I would like to just end though with, I think what David has been bringing up has been really crucial around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And how do we do this better, more intentionally? Because WIOA could really be improved with a much sharper lens around that, because we have to invest where the need is. And the BIPOC communities have not been served well or right, and still aren't, and we could do far better. And so I think David's points just have to really be amplified, because that's where the need is. That's where we have to go as a society. Completely agree.
Right. Well, we're about at time. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. This has been a great panel. I want to thank Workday for supporting the event, Black Economic Alliance, and Jobs for the Future for co-hosting the event. Big thanks to our panelists. Huge thanks to Representative Blunt Rochester for really compelling remarks, and to Dane Stangler for moderating the Congresswoman's conversation. And also, thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in today and asking some really great questions. Hope to see you guys next time, and it's been a really great discussion.
Great.
Thank you.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day, great week.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.